The heartbreaking story of Blanche Monnier isn't your typical true crime cat and mouse tale about a killer and their victims. In fact, nobody dies in this story at all. But if there's one thing we can take away from this woman's horrific ordeal, it's that even when you escape with your life, you don't always get to go back to the one you once had. As a species, humans are capable of unbelievable cruelty. We're not talking about crimes that stop at the edge of a blade or in the barrel of a gun. They can also exist in the darkness. At age 25, Blanche Monnier was a beautiful woman. She was born to an aristocratic family in France on March 1st, 1849. Her mother, Louise, very much a matriarchal archetype, ruled the household with an iron fist. As Blanche grew into adulthood and men began to notice her beauty, Madame Monnier pressured her to find a husband. Blanche had many suitors, it seems, but she had her heart set on one man in particular, a man that her mother, overbearing woman that she was, absolutely could not stand. The object of her affection was a lawyer with a mere fraction of the fortune that the Monnier family possessed. Naturally, for a woman of Blanche's status in high society, this would not do. Despite Madame Monnier's increasing annoyance, Blanche remained defiant. She insisted that she was going to marry the man she loved, whether her mother approved or not. And then one day, she vanished. Astonishingly, nobody asked any questions. Although her brother Marcel and the servants in the house were fully aware of what had happened, the family went about their business as usual, as if Blanche had never existed in the first place. After the event, neighbours admitted that they often heard a woman screaming, but it wasn't uncommon in those days to keep the mentally disturbed hidden away in attics or cellars, so nobody ever investigated it. They just assumed Blanche had lost her mind and her family kept her locked up in the house instead of keeping her in an asylum. On May 23rd, 1901, an anonymous letter was sent to the Attorney General in Paris that claimed there was a woman locked up in a house located in an upscale neighbourhood in Poitiers. The letter described the woman as half-starved and living in extreme filth, and listed the address for the Monnier residence. Although they didn't really expect to find anything, the police did their due diligence and went to investigate. They were completely unprepared for what they would find. At first, it appeared as though only two people lived in the Monnier house, Louise, the elderly matriarch, and her son, Marcel. They were both well-respected members of the community and the pinnacle of high society. Madame Monnier had received an award from the Committee of Good Works for her charitable efforts, while her son was an accomplished law school graduate. Their social status couldn't keep the police from conducting their search, however, or completely obscure the horrors hidden deeper in the house. During the investigation, the authorities came across a door upstairs that had been padlocked shut. They broke the door down and gained access into a pitch-black room. Suddenly, a powerful stench of rotten food and human excrement overwhelmed them. Desperately, the officers rushed to the window, frantic to open it and get a breath of fresh air. In their hurry, the curtains fell to the floor in a heavy cloud of dust. The shutters, nearly cemented shut by time and filth, had to be removed from their hinges to get the window open. As the sun's rays illuminated a room that hadn't seen light in decades, they noticed a woman on the bed, covered with a filthy blanket. Emaciated, stark naked, and surrounded by rotten scraps of food and her own waste, Blanche Monnier was a horrifying shadow of the beautiful girl she'd once been. After being held captive in the dark for so long, the poor woman, now in her 50s, had lost her mind. The sight of the strange policeman terrified her. She hadn't seen the light, worn clothes, or had any visitors for over 2 decades. There were bugs crawling all over her and the rotting pile of straw that served as her bed, and everything was crusted over with filth. The putrid smell had even the most seasoned officers running from the room to vomit. She was incapable of coherent speech and had been given little more than scraps to eat. Her body had withered away until little more than a living skeleton remained. On the walls all around her, she'd scratched the word liberty. The police rushed Blanche to the hospital and turned their attention to her family members. The whole time her daughter was being tended to, Louise Monnier sat downstairs in the living room in stunned silence. Marcel, however, had plenty to say about his sister. He claimed that she was an angry woman, easily excitable and full of rage, and that she'd brought it all on herself. This was a little hard to believe, though, given what the doctors at the hospital observed. In the following days, they saw a woman that was frail and weak, barely able to talk. Her excitement at being given basic things like a bath and a clean change of clothes was no doubt a heartbreaking thing to witness for those in charge of assisting her rehabilitation. The investigators didn't believe Marcel's version of events, and both remaining Monniers were arrested. Only then were they able to piece together the full picture of how Blanche came to be in her wretched state. When her mother rejected her chosen lover, Blanche threatened to elope. Louise, outraged that her daughter would dare to defy her and ruin the family name, locked Blanche in an upstairs bedroom and refused to let her out unless she agreed to break things off with the man she loved. Although the madame expected her to cave quickly, Blanche never agreed to the terms, and so she was never released. Sadly, records suggest that her beloved, the lawyer, died in 1885, a mere 9 years into what would become a 25-year incarceration. As details of the horrific way Blanche was forced to live emerged, outrage grew. An angry mob gathered around the prison her mother was kept in, much to the madame's shock. Many of her neighbours and former friends turned on her, hungry to give her tormented daughter a little vengeance. The elderly woman, already experiencing poor health, did not last long in prison. 15 days after her arrest, Madame Monnier died from a heart condition. It was speculated that the emotional turmoil of being screamed at, shamed, and threatened by the people who used to hold her in high regard was a factor. Others believed her death was brought about by the crushing guilt that had swept over her after finally realizing the horror that she had subjected her daughter to. No matter the reason for the decline in her health, her death meant that Marcel Monnier would stand trial alone. While testifying on his own behalf, he refused to accept any blame, claiming that he went along with his mother's actions out of a sense of duty to her. He insisted that he was too nearsighted to see just how revolting Blanche's conditions were. According to Marcel, he had no control in the house, and their mother supported him financially, so he went along with her whims to avoid being cut off. Still, he did what he could, or so he said, by going into her room to read her the newspaper on a regular basis. On October the 11th, Marcel was sentenced to 15 months in prison. The courtroom, which had been filled to the rafters with public support of his sister, erupted in applause. Ultimately, though, the sweet taste of justice would soon sour. Marcel Monnier immediately appealed his conviction. He argued that he technically hadn't broken any laws, and that his sister's treatment, although neglectful, was never violent. There was no law outlining a, quote, duty to rescue in those days. To the horror of the public, the sentence was overturned on November 30th, and Marcel was released. He inherited the majority of their mother's estate, and he moved to a secluded house out in the countryside, where he would remain until his death in 1913. Blanche would somewhat recover from her ordeal, but she was never the same. Her physical health improved, but psychologically, the trauma and stress had become too much. Being shut in the dark for 25 years had stolen her sanity, and she would never become well enough to rejoin society and reclaim her life completely. She was committed to a sanitarium, where she remained until her death on October the 13th, 1913. Don't forget to check out the other videos on my channel and hit that subscribe button for future uploads. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.